Before Alexandria became Egypt's great window to the Mediterranean, another city guarded the door. Its name was Thonis to the Egyptians, Heraklion or Herakleion to the Greeks. And for centuries it was not a ruin on land. It was a story with no streets. Ancient writers mentioned it. Greek tradition placed it near the mouth of the Nile. Herodotus wrote of a temple to Heracles in this region. Later accounts linked the place to legendary visitors from the world of Homer, though those stories belong more to myth than proof. But the city itself seemed to have vanished. To understand why that mattered, picture Egypt before the rise of Alexandria in the late 4th century BC. The Nile was not just a river. It was a system of power grain taxes. Sailors, merchants, priests, and royal officials all moved through its mouths into the Mediterranean world. A port at that threshold was not just a harbour, it was a checkpoint between civilizations. Thonis Heraklion appears to have been one of those critical gateways. Ships arriving from the Greek world could be inspected there, goods could be taxed, foreigners could be received, religious ceremonies could bind trade to the authority of the Egyptian state. That is the first strange thing about the city. It was not a minor village that slipped quietly from memory. It was once important enough to appear in ancient testimony, important enough to sit at the edge of Egypt's international life, and then it disappeared so completely that scholars had to argue over what it even was. Was Thonis one city and Heraklion another? Were they two names for the same place? Was the city buried under the Nile Delta? Was it lost beneath the sea? For a long time the surviving evidence gave hints, but not certainty. The coast itself had changed, rivers shifted, sediment moved, shorelines migrated. What had once been a living margin of water, mud and temples became almost impossible to reconstruct from texts alone. That is what makes Thonis Heraklion so haunting. It was not erased in a single line from history. It faded between languages, between coastlines, and between the worlds of myth and archaeology. A city that once welcomed ships into Egypt became a question, beneath the waves, and the answer would come not from an ancient library, but from the seabed of Abu Qir Bay. The lost city did not return as a skyline. It returned in fragments from the seafloor. For generations, the western edge of the Nile Delta kept its secret underwater. Abu Qir Bay near modern Alexandria looked like a stretch of ordinary coast. But beneath it lay blocks of stone anchors, statues, temple remains, and objects scattered across the seabed. The modern rediscovery of Thonis Heraklion is closely associated with the underwater archaeological work led by Frank Goddio and the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology around the year 2000. The work did not uncover a city by simply stumbling on one dramatic monument. It built the case piece by piece. Underwater archaeology is slow detective work. Visibility can be poor. Objects may be half buried in sediment. A temple block may lie far from where it first stood. A statue may survive, but not the building that held it. Still, the pattern began to speak. There were colossal stone figures. There were ritual objects. There were shipwrecks and anchors, the language of a harbour. There were remains connected with religious life, especially the worship of Egyptian gods in a city that also carried a Greek name. One of the most important clues was an inscribed stone stele. In broad terms, such inscriptions can anchor a place to a name, a ruler, a tax, a decree, or a cult. In the case of Thonis Heraklion, inscriptions helped connect the underwater remains with the ancient city known from texts. This mattered because the old confusion was not just romantic mystery. Names in the ancient Mediterranean often shifted between languages. A place could be known one way to Egyptians and another way to Greeks. Over time, later readers could mistake two names for two places. The archaeology helped clarify that Thonis and Heraklion were very likely two names tied to the same city. The strangest part is how ordinary the evidence could be. Not a single treasure solving everything, instead a harbour slowly reappearing through bureaucracy, religion, trade, and stone, a tax decree, a temple inscription, an anchor, a statue face rising from silt. Together they turned a half-remembered place into a real urban landscape. The city had not been invented by ancient storytellers, it had been waiting below the waterline. But rediscovery raised a deeper question. How does a major gateway city sink so completely that even its location becomes uncertain? Thonis Heraklion was not forgotten only because it sank. It was forgotten because the world around it moved on. The physical story is still studied carefully. The surviving evidence suggests that parts of the city were affected by a combination of natural forces. Over time, the Nile Delta is built from water sediment and soft ground. In such places, land can subside, sea levels can rise, earthquakes, floods, or sudden soil. Failure may worsen the damage. Archaeologists and geologists do not need to imagine one perfect disaster scene. The more likely picture is slower and more complicated. A city built on unstable delta ground became increasingly vulnerable. Sections may have collapsed, flooded, or slipped beneath the water across centuries. By roughly the medieval period, the site had disappeared from everyday use. Its temples, quays, and streets were no longer part of a living port. But the second disappearance was historical. Alexandria changed everything. Founded by Alexander the Great and developed under the Ptolemies, it became the famous Mediterranean capital of Egypt. It had deep political power, enormous cultural prestige, and a name that survived in books, maps, and memory. Thonis Heraklion, by contrast, became the old gateway, the predecessor, the port before the port everyone remembered. That is how history often buries a place twice, first underwater or earth, then under a more successful story, and yet the city's return changed the way historians imagine Egypt's coastline. It showed that the edge of the ancient Nile Delta was not a blank space before Alexandria. It was crowded with ritual commerce administration and international contact. Foreign ships did not simply drift into Egypt. They entered a controlled landscape. Priests, officials, merchants, and sailors all played roles in a border zone where the Mediterranean met the Nile. The city matters because it turns a lost name into a working system. It reminds us that ancient history is not only made of capitals and conquerors. Sometimes the decisive places are thresholds, harbours, checkpoints, river mouths, places where strangers were measured, taxed, welcomed, and watched. Thonis Heraklion was one of those places. Its ruins now lie underwater, but its meaning is strangely clear. Before Alexandria became the symbol, another city stood at Egypt's maritime door, and for centuries the sea kept that door closed.